Hello and welcome back to Web 110, HTML and CSS. So in the last video, I was talking about how to work with really basic layouts, just being able to use a float to move content so that way it could kind of move out of the regular flow of other content using the clear and overflow properties to be able to break outside of those floats so that way the rest of your content isn't also kind of moving behind other items. And so that's something that is covered in chapter 7 and is something that you are going to use for the homework for assignment 7. And then it's also something that you could potentially use in the future for your final project if you wanted to. Now, there's 2 more videos that I want to make that cover content from chapter 7. This video is going to be talking about print styles. And print styles are going to be something that you're going to need for your final project. And so I'm going to go over how you can add multiple style sheets to your HTML and be able to link multiple style sheets. And then also just talking about general best practices of working with print styles. A lot of it's going to be just general advice. It's not necessarily going to be introducing new HTML or new CSS. There's going to be a little bit of it that's going to be a new introduction. So I'm going to start off with creating just a really basic page in Visual Studio Code, and mostly just to show you how you can link to a style sheet that is specific to working with print. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm just going to save this to week 5, and I'm going to call this, I'm going to say print. Technically, I don't need to have multiple style sheets. I'm trying to determine like how much I want to build this out and how much I want to do more theoretically. Let me create a style sheet. So we're gonna go save as, I'm gonna call this one styles. I'm gonna just put all of these in the same folder. We don't have so many files that it's gonna get too confusing. So there's gonna be a file called styles.css, and then I'm gonna create one more. And I'm gonna just call this print, but this one is gonna be print CSS. So we have 3 files, print.html, styles.css, and then print.css. And let me just create kind of a basic file. If you wanted to do this as well, you could really just take the template I'm going to call this print styles. And we are going to have some links. I'm going to come back. So I'm just going to create 2 links. Actually, you know what? I forgot to put this in the head. And let's put in, an H1. I'll just put H1, this is my heading, and paragraph, this is my sentence. Okay, so we're used to having the link for the external style sheet where you put in that you are linking to style sheet, so that's going to stay the same, and then you link to the name of the file, and you can actually link to multiple style sheets. It's something that I don't quite remember if I had mentioned it, but it's worth highlighting again. You can link all of your files to a shared style sheet, but you can also link to multiple style sheets. and they're going to apply in the order that you have them listed, just like you would have your styles would get applied from your style sheet in the order that they're written, and then same thing as you write them in your styles, they can overwrite what comes above it. So what you could do is you could list multiple styles and have them overwrite each other, but you can also specify how you want them to be used, and that's going to be what we're going to look at. But anyways, let's start here first. I'm going to link, we've got styles.css as an option. So I'm going to copy this, and actually I'll just replace this one, and then we'll have print. Now what we want is for each of these to only happen in certain scenarios, and that's where we get a new attribute that's called media, and we can specify if we want it to be screen, print, or handheld. So if I say, now in this case, styles here would be best for screen, and then I can have one that says this is going to be for print. So if someone goes to print anything, the print style sheet is going to get applied. If anyone is looking at this on a screen device, it's going to bring up the screen styles. So what we could do, I'm going to save this, is if we go to styles, we could add in, and let's just do our regular comment stuff before we get too far. So I could say, well, I want my H1 to have, now the best practice for your screen is your heading can really be anything. This is where we can start having serif fonts, and it would be fine. So we can list this. We could also do, let's do, I'm going to just do background color of black, color of white. Then we can do our paragraph. And here we want to use something that's going to be sans serif. And I'm just picking kind of random colors. Let's go ahead and open this up. So I want to open the print.html. All right, so we've got this background color, and there's way more things that we could be doing with this. I was just trying to pick something that would visually stand out when we do change it. So this is going to be our styles for when we're just looking at it on the screen, and then with our print styles, and I'm going to just copy this for starters. We want to make sure that they're different from each other, and there's a couple of things that we would want to change and really try to remove things to make them better for printing. So you want to try to hide non-essential content. So that would be like banner ads, it could be navigation, it could be images that are used more for decorative purposes. So I don't have any of those things here, so I don't really have to worry about it. But what you would do is, let's say that you have an image. So right now I'm on the print one, and if it makes it a little easier to keep track, we can put a comment here. This is print, and then I could say this one is screen, so I can keep better track of them. So maybe I've got an image. I could say I want the display for image to be set to none. So that way I can kind of hide any images that I don't really need. Maybe I also want to have the navigation so it displays as none, or if I've got like a video or something, I can change that display to none, and it's going to remove it. So that's going to be something that's really handy. And then you also want to think about some of the advice that was talked about back in chapter 3, where there was a graphic for serif versus sans serif. And some of the things I had talked about is that when you are working with your text, it's better for your text to be written in pixels, or M's is probably the best one for your screen. So I could go back to styles and I could say, okay, we want the font size here. Maybe we're going to say like 2M. Let me do 3M. I think that's going to be a better size. And then I could say, I want the font size here to be 1M. Save that. We can refresh it. That's not too bad. Maybe like 1.5 or sorry, 2.5 or something would be better. But then for print, it's going to be better to use points. So I could say font size here, and this is where it's helpful to have a conversion. I don't remember points as well. Let's say like 24 point. And then maybe here I could say I want the font size to be 12 point font. So for print, you want to use points, and then it's better to remove your any sort of color. You basically want to think about how if someone is printing, you don't want to have like large blocks like this of some sort of color, especially black, something that's going to like use up a lot of somebody's ink or maybe not show as well. So you want to try to remove background images. If there's any background images, you want to remove background color. So what we'd want to do here with print is really just simplify down our colors. And you can remove the colors because then the browser defaults will kick in. But if you're concerned about it, what you could do is you could just create a generic style for body. And you could say, I want the background color to be white. And then you could say, I also want the color of the font to be black. And you could still use like grayscale, but it's going to be better for you to find other ways of really building in contrast. So if you have a really complex color palette going on, you want to try to think about how you can recreate the hierarchy of the visual information, but more in a grayscale way where it's not going to matter so much if it is getting printed out. It's also better for legibility if our fonts now are going to be serif. So it's going to be better if we change, and this is going to go back into your hierarchy, because what you could do is you could just say, well, maybe I want all of my text to be Times New Roman, and we could switch this, and we could find other ways of creating contrast. So we could use this as a different way of, we could keep this the same, but then we need to think of a different way of creating contrast. We've got the font size, but maybe we'd want to have the font weight, which by default, there should already be font weight set to bold for your headings. But you might want to think about other things, like maybe in this case, we would want to have maybe we want to just underline all of our headings to try to make them stand out a little bit. That's something that you might think about doing. And you could pick a different serif font too. It doesn't have to be Times New Roman. But you do want to try to think about how you can increase the legibility so that way when people are reading it, they can see everything clearly. You also want to control your page breaks as best as possible. So you can use page break before or page break after to control page breaks when printing for web pages. So we can go ahead and save this. And depending on your browser, you may or may not be able to actually preview. So if I go to File, Print, when I'm on this page, I should be able to see my print styles now. So we can see that that purple has been removed. That background color has been removed. It's pretty small, so it's probably hard to see, but now it's a serif font for both things. So you would just want to make sure that your print styles are going to be legible and easy enough to read. And when you're working on your final project, you're not going to have to put a ton of effort into your print style sheet. What I would really recommend, and this is going to make a little bit more sense when you get to that point, when we've actually gone over how to have the set styles, but you're going to eventually have desktop styles, tablet styles, and mobile styles. And what I would say when you're working with print is it's probably going to be best to take your mobile styles, so that way everything is single column and you don't have to worry about having multiple columns. Turn everything into a single column, and then from that mobile single column set of styles, go in and start removing those things that are not going to be optimal for printing. So switch over the fonts, switch over the colors, remove things that are visual that you don't necessarily need. Think about ways that you can kind of remove unnecessary white space, because that's another thing, is you don't want what people are printing to take up too much paper, so that way they're wasting a lot of paper and a lot of room. You want to try to make things more condensed, so that way it really fits the space more economically. So just some things to consider. A lot of times I get students where what they'll do with the final project is they'll just copy over their styles from their screen styles and they'll just bring them over to their print styles. And if you do that, I'm just going to count it as a 0, because it's really not accomplishing what you need. And I would even say it's going to be easier to write them from scratch than to remove, because you, along with the browser's defaults, you really only need to address just a few basic things. Usually you can add maybe 10, 20 styles and it'll work fine. Versus if you were to take your actual final style sheet and try to just use that and then remove things, you're going to end up with a lot of stuff that you really don't need, that's not necessary. And that's why I like to recommend starting with the mobile styles, because that at least helps narrow it down, where you're not having to worry about having a multi-column layout or anything. So this is just a really basic example, but I wanted to show you a couple of website pages so I could kind of show you how things are working well or not. All right, so I'm not sure if this is still going to be problematic or not. I do know that this page isn't as bad as it used to be since the last time I've shown it in class, but since I have the link already, I feel like it's a good place to start. One thing that I've noticed over the years is that blog websites, especially ones that are trying to give you directions for how to do something like cooking, I've noticed that a lot of times they have a really bad print view, and usually they have other ways of handling it. Like there's these options here where I can go to print, and what they do is they actually give you a different version of the information to try to make it more print friendly. So this is actually a really good thing that they've included. And they even have this option here where this actually ties into our next video, where I'm going to talk about how you can add links to specific sections on a page. And what you do is you create an ID and then you create a button and it jumps you down to that content. So that's really handy. They have this nice clear recipe information. Let's see what happens if I go to file, print. And it looks like now what they're doing is they're having it actually switch over, so it's bringing up different information when you go to print it. What used to happen is it would actually try to print out this whole page, and you might have tried doing this before, where you've tried to print out a blog page, but basically this whole navigation, it used to try to print that out. It would print out these really large pictures. And if you've ever tried to print out directions like this, you might have found it annoying too, because a lot of times when you have a blog like this, they like to give you some motivation, like why did they decide to make this recipe? So they've got all this narration about, like here it says, and actually I'm not trying to be a good girl at all, but that's another story. There's all these things, something about trying to feed all these kids. It is nice that there's pictures to help illustrate the steps, but they're very large, and it would be something that maybe somebody doesn't want actually printed. And you can see we've got all this filler kind of content that's not necessarily helping. Some of it is, like we've got, cracking in an egg. So it might be nice to have something in between where you get some information, but not all of this. There's a lot of duplicates here. We don't need probably 3-4 pictures of the cookies on a cooling rack. That's kind of excessive. And then one of the things you'll often see on a website like this is links to other topics that are kind of related. And then a lot of times you'll also see comments, which I'm not seeing those on here, which is really great. In the past, when I've gone to look at this, in the past, you go to print and it ends up where there's 20 pages of comments. So this could definitely be a lot worse. So I would say that luckily this has switched over to being a better example of how to work with printing rather than a bad example. And there are some things that are handled still with color, but I would imagine that if you were to go and print this, that there's enough difference between this information that even if you were to print in grayscale, it's probably going to look pretty similar. And it's filling up this page pretty well. All right, so that's kind of one example. All right, so behind the scenes, I did a little digging around so I could find a different sort of blog website so that way I could show you a little bit better of what things could look like if you don't have a print sheet. So this is Williams-Sonoma, and we've got the perfect chocolate chip cookies, and we've got a big picture, popular posts on the right. We've got some other posts on the right, got a search. A lot of times you'll see information on the right that might have like similar kind of tags depending on how the website's built, especially if it's like something like a WordPress website, you'll see a lot of that stuff. So we've got some big pictures, we've got different steps along the way. And then this was what I was really looking for, was related posts and then just a bunch of different comments. And I didn't look really closely to see if they had a nice convenient print button like the other one had. But if I go here to file print, this is what I see. So we've got the really large icon, we've got all of this navigation items, we've got our breadcrumb trail, we've got our header, and then because they're not controlling the size of the content, we have this huge empty white space that's taken up, and you can see we've got one of 63 pages. Here we've got a gigantic picture of the cookies. We've got some more. Here we actually have the text as being halfway cut off, where it's not fitting in. And then we've got this picture is being partially cut off. This next picture is going on to the next screen, so it's not scaling at all. And then we've got all of our comments. So like luckily if someone knows what they're doing, they could go in and they could say, I only want to print from this page to this page. But if someone were maybe not as tech savvy, they maybe wouldn't know how to only print out certain pages, and they would probably be very annoyed at the fact that they're having to print out these full-scale pictures that are taking up a ton of ink versus, now in this case, you can maybe have one picture, but I really don't see a need for every single one of these pictures. Unlike the last one, they're really not illustrating any particular steps or anything, and it's more so you just know what the end result looks like. So I think that you could probably have like one of the pictures show up and then you could probably remove the rest of them. So that's one example. Something else that I really like to look at is e-commerce websites, because that's another place where you often will have different ratings or places where people might make comments. And so if we just kind of look at a product item, here we've got a book, and we've got different options of purchasing the book. We've got an overview of information, product details about the author, so we can kind of switch back and forth. Editorial reviews. Now, something like this should really be left aligned. It's maybe not the hardest to read, but a paragraph like this really shouldn't be centered. And then we've got different ratings. And then we've got the footer. So now I don't necessarily know why someone might want to print this out. Maybe you are trying to recommend a book to somebody, or maybe you've got like a birthday or a holiday coming up where you somebody wants to know what they should buy you, and you were printing this out or something. Whatever the case may be, let's look and see what this looks like printed. So we've got this banner ad, which doesn't need to be there. That's something that could get removed. We've got listen and save with the Barnes & Noble audiobook subscription, so another thing. So we've got tons of things up here that are not needed. Little tiny picture of the book, which that's fine, but it's wasting a lot of space. We've got this little cropped bit from somewhere. And then we've got information like add to wish list. That doesn't really need to show up. I guess it would be beneficial to say like what it is, like hardcover. And there were options for how to buy it, but it's not really looking like it's showing the list of options. And maybe that is something that we'd like to know if we were printing this. Maybe we'd like to know that we could have bought it for the Nook, or we could have bought it as a paperback or something. So we have options for things that aren't actually interactive. Like when we were printing it, we're looking at a history of the information. We don't really necessarily need all these UI things. Overview, that makes sense. And here we actually have everything lining up to the left. That makes it a little easier. Related collections and offers, that might be important. This looks kind of odd. This doesn't have any padding here, so it's real close to the edge. We've also got lots of white space. And then we've got customer reviews, and I mean, that can kind of go either way. Maybe you're interested in the customer reviews in this case. And then we've got a lot of information about how to find a store, shop by category. I don't think any of that's necessary for printing out. It's really not helping with the information. So that's another place that you can kind of look to see whether or not a website is really sharing information that you think would be beneficial or not. All right, so one last example. I really like to take a look at Wikipedia. It's maybe not the most exciting website for looking at content, but it's a really great informational hub of information. Even just looking at this, they've already gone and done a lot to try to optimize their content to make it accessible. It used to be that there would be a lot of serif fonts, but you can even see here that they're trying to use fonts that are easier to read. They're using a lot of color coding. And what I like to show about this is because they have so much content, they really try to make their template as simple as possible so that way it can apply to a lot of different pages. And so what they kind of have going on is they've got sort of a main column of information, and then they have a tendency to, and I'm assuming that these items are basically floated to the right, and they're just kind of interspersed with this content. They might be in their own column, but you can kind of see that even this column, the content's not all the same size. So I would assume that it's more that it's these containers or images that are just kind of floated amongst the rest of the content. And they're using color coding, like here they're using the color coding to help kind of describe the different information, like subspecies and everything. And they have a little bit of colors to kind of create these little kind of tiles for the images. So we have kind of this consistent look, and there's a lot of information. Now it depends a lot on the purpose of this, because there's a lot of things that it would be nice when you're going to print that you might not necessarily need some information, like here with the see also. That would be something that you might not necessarily need. Now, if you were doing a research paper, you would probably appreciate having all these references, because then you could go and you could look up all this reference information on your own. It is quite a bit of information though, but it's nice that it's towards the bottom, because then you could choose if you wanted to print those pages or not. Here we have bibliography, external links, Now this, because you can't click on it when it's printed, this would actually be beneficial if they would write out what the actual address is, so you could go and you could look at it on your own. And then this sort of like subcategory information and these different categories, that might be something that wouldn't necessarily be needed. But let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like when you go to print it. So they really simplify things. You might be able to notice it's kind of small, but they switched to a serif font. They've removed the colors, but they still have underlines underneath of things, so that way you could tell what would have been clickable links. They removed a lot of this color in this sidebar, but there's still enough contrast there that even if you were to print this in grayscale, you would be able to see that difference. There are some things that kind of crop a little awkward. Like this would be better if it went onto the next page, so that way you could see that heading with all the categories underneath of it. And there's still some awkward blocks. Like here's this awkward white space that's not getting really used very well. But again, considering that this is sort of a template that's being used a lot, I think that it's still managing to do a whole lot anyways. They are kind of removing some of the styles for the pictures, so there's kind of less of a defined border between the pictures and the rest of the content. This text here is justified, and so it's spanning all the way from edge to edge, which kind of helps make it look a little bit more neat and organized, versus here you can see that this text is all left aligned, so that way it resizes with the content. So that's another difference. That could be something that you could consider using in your design, is switching things so that it's justified. And the pictures were already kind of small anyway, so I don't really see too much of an issue with the pictures. A lot of it's just like sometimes some of it's a little awkward, but it's really not too bad. And they're using a lot of these horizontal rules to kind of help break up the content, but the regular website was doing that as well, and they've got pretty clear headings too to help divide up the content. They do still include the see also, which I would say I think isn't as necessary, but you would have to do research to figure out what your users want. We've got all the references. Now, some of this I wish that they had links that would actually kind of shorten these, because no one would want to have to type this all out without a link and have to try to read all of that. Okay, and then we have bibliography, external links, and then they have sort of this simplified footer. So they did end up removing some of their more internal content. They wanted to include this information that would help with someone trying to do research, but some of this more navigation type items that are part of the website, they decided to remove that. So they did make some choices to try to simplify things so people wouldn't end up having to print out too much information. All right, so that's going to be a couple of different ways of thinking about working with print styles. You're going to have a section in your book in chapter 7 that's going to give you some tips on different things that you could do as well. And then that's something that we're going to look at more for the final project and talk about it. But the biggest things are just going to be removing things that you don't need, really thinking about your color so that way you can save people ink, and then also thinking about your white space, images, ways that you can help save people space so they're not having to waste a lot of paper if they were actually to print things out as well. So if you end up having any questions about working with print styles, you can leave a comment on the discussion, or you can send me an email.